The brutal conflict that historians would later grimly name the War of Three Hammers, marking the tumultuous first phase of the civil strife, began when Lord Daemon Targaryen, a man of peace and foresight, attempted to mediate between the feuding, increasingly irreconcilable factions. The Targaryens, renowned for their prophetic gifts and their aloof yet respected neutrality, had always painstakingly maintained a carefully balanced position in the often treacherous inter-family politics, choosing to advise and guide rather than to overtly command. But Lord Daemon's earnest efforts at peacemaking, tragically, were perceived as weakness by the more aggressive, bloodthirsty houses, who saw only an opportunity to seize power. And when he made a desperate plea for a formal conclave to resolve the escalating dispute, both sides, contemptuous of peace, arrived at the designated meeting place with their full military retinues, their dragons circling menacingly overhead. The ancient amphitheater, a venerable forum where the conclave was held, had borne witness to many heated debates and fierce political clashes over the centuries, but never anything approaching the sheer, unbridled chaos that erupted when Lord Mikar Cohorus, his face contorted with fury, openly accused Lady Visenya Belaris of orchestrating the cold-blooded mine murders. Before anyone, horrified, could intervene, Visenya, a woman of formidable spirit and deadly skill, had instantly drawn her exquisite Valyrian steel blade and, with blazing eyes, challenged him to personal combat. The duel that ensued was brief, but breathtakingly brutal, a flurry of steel and rage, ending with chilling swiftness when Mikar's superior sword skills left Visenya, her body grievously wounded, bleeding and dying on the hallowed amphitheater floor, her final breath a testament to the savagery that had now consumed Valyria. Her death cry, a chilling, final testament to Valyria's sudden descent into fratricidal madness, was answered by a guttural roar that ripped through the very fabric of the world. It belonged to the great bronze dragon, one of Visenya's most fiercely loyal mounts, who had been waiting outside the amphitheater, its patience frayed by the sounds of struggle within. With a shriek born of grief and unbridled rage, the colossal beast slammed into the ancient walls, shattering centuries-old fused stone like fragile glass. Dust and debris exploded inward, carrying with them the sheer force of its momentum. Within the blood-soaked chamber, its sudden, fiery arrival filled the air with scorching heat and choking smoke. Lords and ladies, still reeling from Mikar's brutal victory, scattered in terror, their noble status forgotten in the desperate scramble for survival. The dragon's flames swept through the arena, incinerating all in their path, while the ensuing stampede trampled others underfoot. Several more highborn dragonlords, once untouchable symbols of Valyria's might, met their ends either consumed by dragonfire or crushed beneath the panicked throng. With their deaths, the last flicker of hope for any peaceful resolution to the conflict was extinguished, replaced by a searing certainty of all-out war. What followed was a conflict unlike any the world had ever witnessed, for Valyria had turned upon itself. Previous wars had been fought against foreign enemies, rebellious Giscari or plundering barbarians, conflicts that, paradoxically, often unified the dragon lords. But this was kinslayer against kinslayer, dragon against dragon, fire against fire, with the very heart of the empire as the battleground. The majestic cities, marvels of architecture and magic, painstakingly built over centuries, swiftly devolved into hellish war zones. Dragonfire painted the night skies in hues of apocalyptic red and gold, and the screams of the dying echoed eerily off the magically fused stone walls, which had been meant to endure for eternity, now merely amplifying the symphony of despair. The empire cleaved into distinct, warring factions. From the forbidding northern territories arose the Northern Coalition, proudly styling themselves the Steel Compact. They held sway over the traditional military strongholds, vast, unyielding fortresses and strategic mountain passes that guarded the hallowed approaches to the 14 Flames, the very source of Valyria's power. Their aerial arsenal comprised primarily the great war drakes, monstrous, ancient creatures bred purely for battle. Their shimmering, obsidian-hard scales were said to turn aside enemy fire with contemptuous ease, while their own searing breath could melt bronze armor at 100 yards, turning seasoned warriors into smoking skeletons in an instant. Led by the venerable houses Coerus and Versar, whose lineages stretched back to the first dragon riders, they fought with the ruthless, disciplined tactics that had allowed Valyria to conquer half the known world. Their ground forces a steel-clad hammer to their dragon's fiery anvil. Conversely, the Eastern Alliance, who called themselves the Golden Accord, commanded fewer dragons in sheer numbers, but controlled the vast economic infrastructure of the Empire. Their strength lay not in brute force, but in strategic advantage and unparalleled wealth. Their dragons were primarily the swift courier drakes, renowned for their incredible speed and endurance, and smaller, more agile breeds specifically developed for exploration, reconnaissance, and the protection of crucial trade convoys. Crucially, they controlled the sprawling network of ports and vital trade routes that funneled immense wealth from across the Empire and distant continents into Valyria. This gave them the unparalleled resources to hire vast mercenary armies from the free cities and beyond, supplementing their smaller dragon forces, and to purchase exotic, often forbidden, weapons from the most remote and mysterious lands. Their cunning and financial might were formidable. A third major faction emerged not from ambition, but from a desperate plea for humanity. The Southern Houses, led by the ancient and respected family of Valyria, declared themselves strictly neutral. Horrified by the escalating savagery, they dedicated their efforts to protecting the civilian population from the war's worst excesses. They established sprawling refugee camps in the more remote, coastal parts of the peninsula, their vast caverns and hidden coves offering a fragile sanctuary. With their unique sea dragons, creatures less prone to fire and more at home in the vast, churning waters, they undertook perilous missions to evacuate non-combatants, ferrying thousands across the tempestuous seas to perceived safety. This humanitarian effort earned them the profound gratitude of countless common people, but it also bred deep suspicion in both major factions, who viewed neutrality not as compassion, but as a treacherous form of betrayal, a refusal to commit to the survival of the greater Valyrian cause. The fighting reached its most horrifying crescendo during what became universally known as the Year of Burning Rain. A titanic aerial battle raged above the very heart of Valyria city itself, involving over 60 dragons, a number that seemed to defy the limits of the sky. Their combined flames, a ceaseless deluge of infernal heat, generated thermal updrafts so cataclysmically powerful that they ascended into the upper atmosphere, profoundly affecting weather patterns across the entire peninsula. For months afterward, the land was cursed. Precipitation fell not as life-giving water, but as a fine, abrasive ash mixed with droplets of molten glass, a corrosive downpour that hissed and steamed upon impact. It sculpted a true hellcape where nothing could grow, and even the simple act of breathing required constant protection, forcing citizens to don crude masks or seek refuge in subterranean shelters. During this period of unnatural atmospheric chaos, the mysterious affliction that had been subtly affecting dragons throughout the Empire suddenly intensified with terrifying speed. Entire bloodlines of these magnificent creatures, once the proud symbols of Valyrian dominion, began to simply refuse to fly, their mighty wings seemingly weighed down by an invisible despair. More horrifying still, some actively turned against their riders, their eyes clouded with a chilling malice, as if the ancient, magical bonds that had held human and dragon together for millennia were violently dissolving under the unbearable stress of this fratricidal civil war. The revered dragon keepers, custodians of centuries of lore and wisdom, reported behaviors unlike anything recorded in their vast, hallowed archives. Previously loyal mounts became erratic, unpredictably aggressive, their roars turning from familiar commands to primal screams of fury, and in some tragic cases, completely uncontrollable, wreaking havoc in their confined pits. The most disturbing incident of all occurred when Balerion the Great, legendary for being the oldest, largest, and most formidable of all living dragons, simply vanished. The ancient, coal-black creature had been resting in his customary, colossal lair deep within the Dragonmont, a vast, hallowed mountain carved into a complex of dragon holds, when his keepers arrived one morning to find the immense chamber utterly empty. There was no sign of struggle, no shattered stone, no scorch marks on the fused rock, no explanation whatsoever for how something so enormous could have departed without being seen or heard. Some whispered that he had finally been killed, his immense body somehow spirited away and hidden by agents of a rival house. Others clung to the hope that he had fled to some distant, forgotten land, seeking solitude from the madness. But many more began to whisper a far more unsettling truth, that the great dragon had simply faded away, his colossal life force, intricately linked to the Empire's magic, depleted and consumed by the magical chaos that was devouring Valyria itself. The Civil War's most enduring and insidious damage was not merely the cities razed or the lives extinguished, but the systematic, deliberate breakdown of the very institutions that had made Valyrian civilization possible. The great libraries, once gleaming citadels where the accumulated knowledge of ages, philosophy, history, sorcery, and science was meticulously stored on scrolls of priceless parchment, became ignominious battlegrounds. There, ancient texts, irreplaceable wisdom, were treated with barbaric contempt, tossed into bonfires as mere kindling for dragonfire, their knowledge lost forever in plumes of smoke and ash. The legendary workshops where Valyrian steel, that impossibly sharp and lightweight metal, was forged through arcane secrets and dragonfire, fell silent and were abandoned. Their master smiths, the last living custodians of these invaluable techniques, either fled in terror or died in the chaos, taking their priceless secrets with them into the grave. Most tragically, the careful, centuries-long breeding programs that had produced the Empire's diverse and powerful dragons were utterly disrupted. Precious bloodlines, honed for specific purposes and bearing unique traits, were scattered to the winds, or, in acts of spiteful cruelty, deliberately destroyed by rival factions, ensuring that an ancient magic would never again be fully replicated. Religious authority, once a unifying force, collapsed with equally devastating speed. The fire priests, who had served for millennia as spiritual guides and interpreters of the sacred flames, became hopelessly entangled in the conflict. Some, clinging to tradition, zealously supported the Steel Compact's claims to traditional legitimacy and ancient rights, while others, driven by a thirst for change, backed the Golden Accord's alluring promises of sweeping reform. The great temples, once neutral, sacred ground where all Valyrians could seek solace and guidance, were swiftly converted into grim fortresses. Their sacred fires, which had burned continuously in worship for centuries, were now utilitarian beacons for military communications, their pure light twisted to guide weapons of war. The unified faith that had once bound the Empire together fractured into myriad competing sects, each claiming divine favor and prophetic validation for their chosen faction, further deepening the spiritual chasm tearing Valyria apart. The war's most bizarre and unsettling episode was the infamous dancing plague that swept through Valyria during the conflict's 4th year. Without warning, thousands of people, seemingly at random, were seized by an irresistible, horrifying compulsion to dance. They would move with frenzied, unnatural energy, their eyes glazed, their limbs flailing, continuing without rest or sustenance until they collapsed from sheer exhaustion, often bleeding from their feet and frothing at the mouth. This macabre affliction struck dragonlords and slaves alike, an indiscriminate curse that ravaged entire districts of the great cities, rendering normal life utterly impossible in the affected areas. Some blamed enemy sorcery, a dark magical contagion loosed upon the populace. Others saw it as divine punishment, the gods themselves condemning Valyria's hubris and kinslaying. But the true cause of this grotesque phenomenon was never determined before the plague mysteriously ended, vanishing as suddenly and inexplicably as it had begun, leaving behind a legacy of trauma and unanswered questions. Economic collapse followed inevitably, a cascading catastrophe that mirrored the Empire's internal decay. Vast, meticulously maintained trade routes, which had once funneled wealth and exotic goods across continents, were disrupted by the incessant fighting, leaving markets bare and coffers empty. The very infrastructure of empire crumbled from neglect and damage. The great Valyrian roads, engineering marvels that had once carried goods and legions with ease, became perilous paths where desperate bandits preyed on travelers, their illicit activities compounded by the terrifying spectacle of dragons battling overhead. The elaborate financial systems that had managed the wealth of half the known world disintegrated into chaos as different regions fell under the control of competing factions, each defiantly issuing their own currency and rejecting the authority and coinage of their rivals. It was a clear sign of a power vacuum, and foreign enemies, watching from afar, began to take keen notice of Valyrian weakness. The free cities, long cowed into subservience by the overwhelming supremacy of Valyrian dragonlords, began to assert their independence more boldly, their demands growing louder, their actions more defiant. Pirate fleets, once notorious for fleeing at the mere sight of dragon wings on the horizon, now brazenly raided Valyrian shipping with alarming impunity, their success further emboldening others. Most ominously, intelligence reports from the far-flung reaches of the Empire spoke of strange, unsettling stirrings in distant lands, of old, forgotten enemies slowly gathering strength, and new, unknown threats emerging from the furthest, darkest corners of the known world, like predators sensing weakness in a wounded giant. The war finally began its slow, agonizing wind down, not through the decisive victory of any single faction, but through the bitter, all-encompassing exhaustion of all involved. The once mighty dragon population had been reduced by more than half, with many of the greatest and most ancient bloodlines, irreplaceable founts of power and magic, lost forever to the chaos. The human population of the Valyrian Peninsula itself had been utterly devastated by years of unrelenting warfare, brutal famine, and widespread, unchecked disease. The magical resources that had powered every aspect of Valyrian civilization were showing undeniable signs of severe depletion. Even simple enchantments, once effortlessly woven, now required enormous, draining effort to maintain, their shimmering light growing dim. A fragile, uneasy peace was eventually negotiated, a testament to desperation rather than reconciliation, through the tireless intervention of the few remaining neutral houses. Among these, House Targaryen, whose prophetic gifts had allowed them terrifying glimpses of even greater, more existential disasters to come if the fighting continued, played a crucial, mediating role. The resulting Treaty of Smoking Stones, named for the scarred, volcanic landscape where it was signed, established new, begrudged boundaries of influence among the surviving factions and, crucially, created rudimentary mechanisms for resolving future disputes without immediately resorting to devastating dragonfire. But the irreparable damage had been done. The profound unity that had made Valyrian expansion and dominance possible was shattered beyond repair, replaced by a suspicious, tenuous cooperation that could collapse at any moment. The empire still technically existed, it still controlled vast, sprawling territories, and it still commanded the nominal loyalty of millions of subjects, but it was no longer the invincible colossus that had once dominated the known world. The insidious seeds of its ultimate destruction had been irrevocably planted in the ashes of its own civil war, and they were already beginning to sprout, unseen and relentless, in the deepening darkness beneath the 14 flames. In the aftermath of these devastating civil wars, the Valyrian freehold entered what historians, looking back through the mists of time, would later recognize as its final, agonizing century of existence. Though none alive at the time, still caught in the immediate throes of exhaustion and a fragile peace, could have possibly imagined that the greatest, most advanced empire in human history had so little time remaining on the world stage. The exhausted dragon lord families, their numbers decimated, their unity shattered, and their ancient pride bruised, embarked on a desperate, often futile, attempt to rebuild their once glorious civilization. Yet, in their fervent denial, they largely ignored the increasingly ominous signs that their magical foundations, the very bedrock of their existence, were crumbling beneath them, a silent catastrophe far more profound than any battle. The immediate, overriding priority was a frantic restoration of the Empire's military strength. This was not merely to reassert control over rebellious or distant provinces, but more urgently, to defend against the growing boldness of myriad enemies who had keenly noted Valyrian weakness during the protracted civil wars. On the eastern frontiers, the relentless Dothraki hordes had begun launching raids deeper and deeper into Imperial territory. Their swift, bloodthirsty horsemen struck at settlements that had known centuries of peace under Valyrian protection, plundering and burning before vanishing back into the endless grasslands like phantoms. Even more disturbing were the sparse, chilling reports from the far south, where the mysterious and forbidden Shadowlands beyond Ashai were said to be stirring with an unnatural activity that defied all rational explanation, hinting at ancient evil's reawakening. Lord Aerion Targaryen, whose uncanny prophetic dreams had played a pivotal role in finally bringing the civil wars to an end, became increasingly troubled by visions that seemed to depict the Empire's future, but with a terrifying new twist. Unlike the clear, actionable glimpses of coming events that had established his family's legendary reputation for foresight, these new dreams were chaotic, fragmented, and maddeningly contradictory. They were filled with terrifying images of fire consuming fire, an empire devouring itself, and, most chillingly, dragons falling utterly silent forever. When he attempted to share these dire warnings with the venerable Council of 40, an assembly notorious for its deep-seated conservatism and self-serving complacency, his profound concerns were summarily dismissed. They were attributed to nothing more than trauma from the recent conflicts, a collective psychological defense mechanism rather than genuine, urgent prophecy. The dragon population, once numbering nearly 800 magnificent beasts at its pre-war peak, had been brutally reduced to fewer than 400. And many of these surviving creatures were young, untested, and often had never properly bonded with their intended riders, a crucial magical and emotional link that defined Valyrian power. The careful, arcane breeding programs, meticulously cultivated over centuries to produce distinct bloodlines optimized for different purposes, from massive war drakes to nimble scouts, lay in utter ruins. Many invaluable genetic lines were lost forever when their dedicated keepers died in the fighting. Attempts to rebuild these programs faced an additional, profoundly unsettling challenge. Many surviving dragons showed a marked reluctance to mate, almost as if some ancient, primal instinct warned them against bringing new life into an increasingly dangerous, dying world. More troubling still was the profoundly altered behavior of the surviving great drakes themselves, those colossal, ancient creatures who had formed the very backbone of Valyrian military might for centuries. These venerable beasts, some of whom had lived for over 200 years, began displaying unmistakable signs of what could only be described as a profound, sorrowful depression. They would lie motionless for days at a time within their vast caverns, refusing food, their once fierce eyes dull and lifeless, showing no interest in flight or even their riders' commands. It was a heartbreaking sight for their devoted masters. And then, in acts of ultimate despair or desperate flight, several of the greatest dragons simply flew away one night, their massive forms disappearing into the darkened sky, never to return, abandoning bonds of loyalty that should have lasted until death. The economic recovery proved equally, if not more, challenging. The vast, intricate trade networks that had enriched the empire for centuries, drawing wealth from every corner of the known world, had been utterly disrupted by years of unrelenting warfare. Furthermore, many overseas territories, sensing the seismic shift in power, had used the chaos to assert their independence or align themselves with rival, burgeoning powers. The free cities, while nominally still part of the empire and technically subject to its decrees, increasingly acted as independent entities. They would remit tribute only when Valyrian dragon-backed expeditions, often costly and draining affairs, arrived to collect it by force, a humiliating testament to the empire's waning authority. Even the great mines, those subterranean marvels that had provided the raw materials for Valyrian industry and sorcery, from the precious ores for Valyrian steel to the exotic crystals for enchantments, were showing signs of exhaustion that went far beyond normal depletion. Shafts that had produced steadily for centuries, yielding rich veins of metal and gem, began yielding strange, pallid ores that crumbled to dust when exposed to air, or, worse, metals that seemed to actively resist being shaped by traditional smithing techniques, bending and breaking with unnatural stubbornness. Most disturbing were the reports from the deepest excavations, where terrified miners spoke of hearing sounds that had no earthly source, ancient, resonant voices speaking in languages that predated human civilization, echoing from the abyssal darkness below. The 14 flames themselves, the very magical heart of Valyria, were behaving in ways that flatly contradicted centuries of careful observation and meticulous documentation. The predictable cycles of eruption and dormancy, which Valyrians had so masterfully harnessed to fuel their cities and their sorcery, were becoming increasingly erratic and dangerous. Some peaks that, according to all historical patterns, should have been vibrantly active, remained stubbornly cold, emitting no heat or smoke, their magical energy seemingly extinguished. While others erupted with unprecedented violence at unexpected times, unleashing torrents of molten rock and ash that ravaged the landscape. The fundamental correlation between volcanic activity and magical power, which formed the unbreakable foundation of Valyrian sorcery, was breaking down, leaving the Empire's most powerful mages struggling desperately to maintain even the most basic enchantments. A profound religious crisis accompanied this accelerating physical decline. The fire priests, who had served for millennia as the spiritual guides and conduits to the sacred flames, found their connection to these divine fires weakening, as if the gods themselves were turning away. Prophecies that had once come clearly and unequivocally through ritual fire-gazing now became murky, contradictory, and terrifyingly obscure. The great ceremonial braziers, which had burned continuously for over 1,000 years in the heart of the temples, began to flicker and dim, requiring constant, exhausting attention to merely maintain their dwindling glow. Some priests, driven to the brink of madness, reported that the flames themselves seemed to whisper dire warnings, speaking of ancient debts that must finally be paid and terrible prices that could no longer be deferred, as if the very earth demanded its due. In the shadows, the enigmatic faceless men, who had operated with silent, surgical precision throughout Valyrian history, became increasingly bold and audacious in their activities. A chilling series of high-profile assassinations targeted not just political leaders, easy targets in a time of civil strife, but also the revered keepers of crucial knowledge. This included the master smiths who maintained the impossibly secret techniques of Valyrian steel forging, the ancient dragon keepers who understood the arcane bonds between human and beast, and the powerful sorcerers who powered the Empire's intricate magical infrastructure. Each death was a small, almost imperceptible wound in the Empire's collective body of knowledge, but collectively, they represented a systematic, insidious campaign to weaken Valyrian civilization from within, severing the vital threads of its existence. Despite these mounting, undeniable problems, the proud Dragon Lord families continued their desperate efforts to maintain the elaborate facade of imperial strength. Grand festivals were still held, lavish affairs designed to celebrate military victories that, in reality, were often costly Pyrrhic affairs, bought at devastating cost in lives and resources. New, ambitious construction projects were grandly announced to demonstrate economic vitality, even as the funds to complete them came from increasingly desperate taxation of already struggling provinces, grinding the populace under an unbearable burden. The Great Pyramids of Valyria, those colossal symbols of power and permanence, still reached majestically toward the sky. But many who looked closely, particularly those with a keen, unsettling foresight, could discern the faint, insidious hairline cracks spreading through their magically fused stone walls, portending an inevitable collapse. The Empire's intellectual life suffered perhaps the most severe and irreversible decline. The great libraries, once vibrant centers that had attracted scholars, mages, and philosophers from across the known world, became neglected repositories. Dust gathered thickly on priceless scrolls that no one had the time, the interest, or often, the remaining literacy to read. The systematic research programs that had driven Valyrian technological and magical advancement for millennia were abandoned. Instead, frantic, undirected efforts were made to desperately search through ancient, often forgotten, texts for quick, magical solutions to immediate, overwhelming problems. Knowledge that had taken centuries to accumulate, to refine, and to master was now being lost faster than it could ever be preserved, plunging Valyria into an intellectual dark age. International relations, once firmly dictated by Valyria's invincible might, grew increasingly tense as former allies, sensing weakness, began to question Valyrian reliability and commitments. The elaborate system of mutual defense treaties that had protected vast imperial territories across the globe now demanded that the empire demonstrate a strength it simply no longer possessed. When the free city of Tyrish was threatened by an audacious coalition of pirates and mercenaries, the Valyrian response was agonizingly slow and woefully inadequate. It required 3 times as many dragons as such an operation should have needed, stretching their depleted forces thin, and ultimately resulted in devastating damage to the city itself. Damage that took years to repair and eroded further faith in Valyria's protective power. The very slave system, the brutal but fundamental engine that had provided much of the empire's labor force and underwritten its immense wealth, was becoming dangerously unstable. Revolts that had once been quickly and savagely suppressed by a single dragon lord now required major, resource-intensive military operations to contain. And even successful suppression left entire regions so utterly devastated that their economic productivity was permanently reduced, a self-defeating cycle. More subtle, yet equally dangerous, was the pervasive spread of new religious movements among the slave populations. Clandestine belief systems that promised liberation through divine intervention and actively encouraged coordinated resistance to their masters, festering beneath the surface like a slow-burning fire. The most ominous and terrifying development of this final, desperate century was the inexplicable emergence of what the Valyrians termed the Silent Zones, eerie, unsettling areas where magic simply ceased to function. These dead spaces first appeared in the remoter, wilder parts of the empire, but gradually, inexorably, they began spreading toward the very heartland itself, like a creeping blight. Within these zones, dragons could not fly, their magical wings suddenly powerless. Valyrian steel lost its supernatural sharpness and became mere mundane metal, unable to cut through shadow or ward off dark enchantments. Even simple fire-starting spells, a basic form of Valyrian sorcery, failed to function. The zones seemed to appear randomly, without warning, and showed no signs of being reversible through any known magical or scientific means, defying all comprehension. Communication across the vast, sprawling empire, once seamlessly facilitated by swift dragon-carried messages and the instantaneous magical sending stones, became increasingly unreliable and dangerous. Messages sent by dragon often failed to arrive, with the great beasts sometimes returning to their pits, their saddles empty, without their riders, and with no explanation for what dire fate had befallen them. The magical communication networks that had allowed instant coordination across vast distances flickered in and out of operation, creating harrowing periods where the imperial capital lost all contact with entire provinces for weeks at a time, isolating them and leaving them vulnerable to external threats and internal chaos. Cultural production during this period vividly reflected the empire's underlying anxiety and pervasive sense of doom. The poetry and art that emerged from the late Valyrian period were conspicuously marked by themes of impermanence, decline, and an approaching, inevitable catastrophe. The great epic, The Fires of Eternity, once a soaring anthem to Valyrian grandeur, was grimly revised during this time to include a new, bleak conclusion that spoke not of endless glory, but of flames that would eventually consume themselves, leaving only ash and the faint, ghostly memory of what once was. Musical compositions became increasingly complex, dissonant, and mournful, as if the inherent harmony that had once characterized Valyrian culture was breaking down, fracturing along with everything else. The astute merchant classes, who had grown immensely wealthy during the Empire's long centuries of expansion, began quietly, subtly moving their vast assets to safer, more stable locations. Gold flowed out of Valyria in a steady, silent stream, channeled toward the burgeoning free cities and beyond, carried by trading expeditions that departed with great fanfare, but returned with suspiciously empty holds and reports of distant markets that were mysteriously no longer profitable. Some of the wealthiest families, sensing the impending collapse, began purchasing extensive properties in distant lands, ostensibly for new business ventures, but clearly as potential refuges, should conditions in the beloved homeland continue their terrifying deterioration. Furthermore, military recruitment became increasingly difficult as the traditional sources of soldiers proved woefully inadequate. The proud citizen soldiers, who had once formed the disciplined backbone of Valyrian armies, were now desperately needed to maintain order in the face of growing domestic unrest and escalating slave revolts. Mercenary companies, sensing the Empire's desperation, demanded higher and higher fees for their services, and many proved unreliable and prone to desertion when faced with the strange, inexplicable phenomena that were becoming commonplace across the Empire. Even the legendary Unsullied, those perfectly disciplined, unyielding soldiers acquired from the conquest of old guys, seemed less effective, less unyielding than they had been in previous generations, their legendary stoicism faltering against the tide of decay. The final decades before the cataclysmic event known as the Doom saw a series of increasingly desperate, often fantastical, attempts to restore the Empire's former glory. Massive, resource-consuming expeditions were launched to explore the farthest, uncharted reaches of the known world, futilely seeking new sources of wealth and, more importantly, new veins of magical power that might replenish their dwindling reserves. These ventures consumed enormous resources and achieved little, often returning with terrifying tales of empty, silent cities, dead lands choked by unknown blights, and seas that boiled without heat, emitting noxious fumes. Some expeditions never returned at all, vanishing into the vast unknown as completely as if they had never existed, swallowed by the growing strangeness of the world. The dragon population continued its inexorable, heartbreaking decline. Fewer eggs were hatching each year in the increasingly silent dragon pits, and those that did often produced creatures that were weak, strangely malformed, or simply wrong in ways that defied description, their scales dull, their eyes clouded, their forms grotesque. The great dragon pit of Valyria, once a roaring, vibrant home to dozens of magnificent beasts, now echoed with a chilling emptiness as more and more of its colossal chambers stood vacant, silent tombs. The remaining dragons, whether by instinct or some deeper, magical sentience, seemed to sense the approaching end, their behavior becoming increasingly erratic and their bonds with their riders growing ever more tenuous, frayed threads of a dying connection. As the final century drew to a close, the once mighty Valyrian freehold resembled nothing so much as a magnificent, elaborate facade concealing a crumbling, rotting foundation. The Great Pyramids still reached imposingly toward the sky, defiant against the heavens. The great roads still carried the ghost of trade across continents, albeit perilously. And dragons, though fewer and more withdrawn, still flew above the smoking peaks of the 14 Flames, their forms silhouetted against the perpetually ash-laden sky. But those with truly discerning eyes, those whose minds were not clouded by denial, could clearly observe the stark, undeniable signs of approaching catastrophe in every single aspect of imperial life, from the highest lord to the lowliest slave. The greatest civilization in human history, blinded by its own hubris and the slow erosion of its magic, was preparing unknowingly for its final, devastating act upon the stage of the world. Among all the proud dragon lord families of Valyria, none possessed a gift more precious, yet more profoundly cursed, than House Targaryen's unique ability to glimpse the intricate, often terrifying, threads of fate itself. For generations, Targaryen dreamers, men and women blessed or afflicted with prophetic sight, had served as invaluable, if sometimes unsettling, advisors to the freehold. Their prophetic visions, often presented with cryptic warnings, had helped to guide imperial policy, allowing Valyria to navigate treacherous political currents and avoid numerous disasters that might otherwise have befallen the seemingly invincible empire. But in the reign of Lord Enar Targaryen, a quiet, contemplative man burdened by the weight of his lineage, this ancient gift would become both a miraculous salvation and an unbearable torment. It would lead to a monumental decision that would, in time, preserve the Targaryen bloodline from oblivion, while condemning them to a future where they would bear witness to the total, horrifying destruction of everything they held dear. Daenerys Targaryen was a mere 12 years old when the dreams began, arriving not as ordinary, childish nightmares, but with the sudden, overwhelming intensity and vividness that marked true prophetic sight. Unlike the controlled, often ritualized visions that her ancestors had experienced during formal scrying rituals, these dreams came unbidden, an unsolicited torrent of future horrors. Often, in the middle of the day, while she went about her normal, mundane activities, Daenerys would suddenly freeze in place, her delicate body rigid, her striking violet eyes staring fixedly at something no one else could see. Tears would stream silently down her face, and her lips would move soundlessly, frantically, as if she were desperately trying to warn someone of an approaching, unseen danger that only she could perceive. The first dream she was able to describe coherently, articulate enough to convey its terrifying message, came during a lavish family feast. The Targaryens were celebrating the successful, if brutal, suppression of a slave revolt in the eastern provinces, raising goblets of fine wine in toast to imperial victory and continued dominion. As the assembled Targaryens, resplendent in their silks and jewels, toasted their fleeting triumph, Daenerys suddenly stood, her youthful face pale and drawn. She spoke in a voice that seemed to emanate not from her young body, but from someone much older, imbued with an ancient sorrow. She described, in horrifying detail, the great city of Valyria consumed by an inferno. Not the controlled, purposeful flames of dragonfire, nor the harnessed volcanic forge-work, but a wild, ravenous fire that devoured stone and flesh alike, leaving nothing but ruin. She spoke of dragons, once proud masters of the sky, falling like burning stars from the heavens, their ancient magic finally, irrevocably exhausted, their forms plummeting into the sea. Most terrifying of all, she described the 14 flames themselves, the very source of Valyria's power and life, turning inward, their volcanic fury consuming the very heart of the empire in a single, catastrophic day of unimaginable destruction. The reaction to her harrowing prophecy was starkly mixed. Some family members, steeped in complacency and perhaps weary of the recent rise of doomsayers throughout the empire, dismissed it outright as the product of an overactive, impressionable imagination. They saw it as childish fright, influenced by the widespread fear and uncertainty that permeated Valyrian society. Others, however, remembering the unsettling accuracy of previous Targaryen visions, urged extreme caution and demanded further investigation, their faces pale with concern. Lord Enar himself was torn, caught between the powerful paternal instinct to protect his innocent daughter from the crushing burden of such terrible knowledge, and his profound responsibility to his ancient house to take her chilling warning with the utmost seriousness. It was a dilemma that would weigh heavily on his soul. As the months passed, Daenerys' visions became not only more frequent but also terrifyingly more detailed, painting an ever clearer, ever more horrifying picture of the inevitable future. She began to see not just the apocalyptic destruction itself, but the slow, agonizing chain of events leading up to it. She witnessed widespread failed harvests, caused by layers of toxic ash from unprecedented, erratic volcanic activity, leading to famine and widespread suffering. She saw dragon eggs, once symbols of hope and power, that would never hatch, their shells cracking open to reveal nothing but dust and crushing disappointment within. She observed the great libraries, sacred bastions of knowledge, burning as panicked scholars desperately fought to save scrolls that crumbled to dust at their frantic touch. Most disturbing of all, she dreamed repeatedly, incessantly, of a specific, dreadful date still years in the future, when all of this, the entire tapestry of horror, would come to pass in a single, cataclysmic day. The relentless onslaught of these prophetic dreams was taking a terrible, visible toll on the young girl. She grew alarmingly pale and thin, often refusing food for days at a time, tormented by the vivid memories of the famine she had witnessed in her visions, the act of eating becoming a painful reminder of future starvation. Sleep became an elusive, cruel mistress. Closing her eyes often triggered new, terrifying prophetic episodes that left her exhausted, shaking, and emotionally shattered. Her tutors, accustomed to her bright, intelligent mind, reported that she would sometimes break down in uncontrollable tears during lessons. Utterly overwhelmed by the crushing knowledge of how temporary and utterly meaningless all their careful learning and ancient wisdom would ultimately prove to be. Lord Enar, desperate for any reprieve for his suffering daughter, consulted with the most learned mages and revered fire priests in all of Valyria, seeking some way to ease her unbearable burden or, at the very least, to verify the horrifying accuracy of her visions. The ancient fire priests, whose own connection to the sacred flames had grown increasingly tenuous and murky, confirmed that Denise's descriptions chillingly matched their own increasingly dark and ominous readings of the sacred fires, as if the earth itself was crying out. The esteemed College of Mages, custodians of arcane research, admitted that their magical researchers were indeed revealing dangerous and escalating instabilities in the complex volcanic system that powered their entire civilization, a truth they had previously suppressed. Most convincingly, and with an unsettling, undeniable accuracy, several of Denise's shorter-term predictions began to come true. The final, undeniable decision to take her dreams with the gravest seriousness was made when Denise correctly predicted the sudden, inexplicable death of a dragon that had shown absolutely no previous signs of illness. Vermithrax the Bronze, one of the mightiest drakes in the venerable Targaryen stable, a creature of immense power and vitality, collapsed and died exactly as she had foreseen, and at precisely the harrowing time she had specified. It was an impossible, tragic confirmation, a chilling glimpse of the future that left no room for doubt. The dragon's death, a spectacle of both immense power and profound tragedy, was swiftly followed by a series of minor volcanic eruptions across Valyria. Each tremor, each plume of ash, perfectly mirrored Danis's harrowing prophecies, leaving no room for doubt even among the staunchest skeptics. The earth itself seemed to confirm her terrifying gift, rumbling with a low, guttural assent to the impending doom. Preparing for the exodus from Valyria, however, proved to be an undertaking of unprecedented complexity and peril. It was not merely a logistical challenge, but a profound act of betrayal in the eyes of the freehold. The Targaryens could not simply declare their intention to abandon their ancestral home. Such a move would be instantly condemned as treason against the dragonlords, an unthinkable affront that would invite immediate and devastating reprisal. They would be forced to provide explanations they dared not utter, for the truth would surely brand them as madmen. Instead, a clandestine operation began. Slowly, subtly, they started liquidating their vast assets, ancient estates, sprawling mines, lucrative trading ventures, and priceless Valyrian artwork. Every transaction was meticulously orchestrated to appear as routine business, yet each sale chipped away at a legacy thousands of years in the making. While secretly severing their roots, they maintained an elaborate charade of unwavering loyalty to the empire, attending lavish feasts, participating in political debates, and publicly reaffirming their devotion to Valyrian traditions. The constant fear of discovery, the paranoia of unseen eyes and whispered accusations, became a suffocating shroud around every Targaryen. The selection of Dragonstone as their destination was based entirely on another of Danis's visions, a striking image of the ancient Valyrian outpost bathed in an ethereal light, a beacon of safety where dragons could endure the coming cataclysm. Built centuries prior as a strategic foothold for potential expansion into Westeros, the fortress had long been abandoned, save for a token garrison. Its remote, storm-lashed location and formidable defenses made it an ideal sanctuary. More crucially, its distinctive Valyrian architecture promised them the ability to preserve their traditional way of life, even in exile. Convincing the proud and deeply entrenched family to undertake such a drastic and seemingly irrational action demanded every ounce of Lord Eonar Targaryen's legendary diplomatic skill and immeasurable courage. For many Targaryens, their roots in Valyria stretched back over 1,000 years, intertwining with ancestral homes, sacred burial grounds, and intricate business interests that seemed utterly impossible to sever. The elder generation, steeped in the glory and tradition of the freehold, struggled most intensely to accept that everything they had worked for, every stone and scroll, would soon be reduced to ash and haunting memory. Some, in their righteous fury and stubborn pride, accused Eonar of cowardice, asserting that a true dragon lord would stand firm, ready to confront whatever threats emerged, rather than fleeing ignominiously to a forgotten outpost. The weight of this generational conflict, the heartache of convincing loved ones to abandon everything they held sacred, bore heavily on Eonar's shoulders. The process of selecting which dragons to take presented its own agonizing challenges. The Targaryens possessed dozens of magnificent drakes, varying in size, age, and temperament. But the arduous journey to Dragonstone, spanning vast stretches of open sea, demanded creatures of exceptional strength and endurance, capable of carrying riders and vital supplies across dangerous skies. After weeks of intense deliberation, prayer, and whispered counsel with their most trusted dragonkeepers, they chose 5 of their finest. Valyrian the Black Dread, already a creature of formidable power. Displaying nascent signs of the colossal size he was destined to achieve, Vagor, swift and fiercely intelligent despite her relatively young age, Meraxes, renowned for her unwavering loyalty and regal demeanor, and 2 smaller drakes, agile and quick, designated to serve as essential scouts and messengers. The others, too numerous to count, would have to be left behind, a silent, terrible sacrifice. Selecting the human personnel proved equally heart-wrenching. The Targaryen household included hundreds of retainers, master craftsmen, scholars, and slaves, all whose unique skills would be indispensable for establishing their new home. But the limited capacity of the available ships meant that only a fraction of their people could embark on the journey. This forced a series of agonizing decisions, tearing apart families and loyal bonds, as Eonar and his closest advisors had to choose who would be invited to join the exodus and who would be left behind to face whatever terrifying fate awaited Valyria. Priority was given to the most skilled dragon keepers, the legendary smiths capable of working the magical Valyrian steel, and the scholars who carried irreplaceable knowledge, their minds' vast libraries of history, lore, and arcane secrets. The cries of those left behind, though muted by the need for secrecy, echoed in the hearts of those chosen, a persistent, mournful refrain. The actual departure had to be choreographed with meticulous precision to avoid any suspicion. Rather than a mass exodus, which would have been impossible to conceal, the Targaryens implemented a gradual withdrawal over several months. Small groups of family members departed on seemingly routine business trips to various corners of the vast Valyrian Empire, their farewells disguised as temporary absences. They would then subtly divert, making their way to secret rendezvous points where ships lay waiting, their holds prepared to carry them west across the treacherous seas. The dragons, too, left in a similar fashion, participating in their normal patrol duties, flying out over the familiar landscape, before simply failing to return to their home bases, their absence initially attributed to extended hunting forays or exploration. Lord Eonar himself remained among the last to leave, maintaining the illusion of normal activity, bearing the weight of deception until the very end. His final act before departing his ancestral home was to descend into a vault, carved deep beneath the foundations of their ancient pyramid. There, he carefully placed the Targaryen seal and the family's most sacred records, along with a deeply personal letter. This letter, penned in his own hand, explained their actions, addressed to any who might discover it after the doom. It expressed his profound hope that their departure would be seen not as an act of abandonment, but rather as an act of desperate preservation, a calculated, heartbreaking attempt to ensure that some remnant of Valyrian civilization, its magic, its knowledge, and its magnificent dragons would survive the unimaginable catastrophe that was fast approaching. The journey to Dragonstone proved harrowing in ways that even Stannis's visions, however vivid, had not fully prepared them for. The skies themselves seemed to conspire against them. Storms, violent and seemingly conjured from nothingness, arose with terrifying frequency, forcing the dragons to battle through cyclonic winds that threatened to tear them from the very sky. Lightning illuminated monstrous waves that crashed against their small fleet, seeming to claw at their ships. Several vessels were lost to what appeared to be random, brutal disasters, their crews and passengers swallowed whole by the tumultuous waves that had been deceptively calm moments before. The very air, thick with a palpable sense of resistance, seemed to strain against their westward progress, as if unseen forces, perhaps the very spirit of Valyria itself, were attempting to prevent their escape. When they finally reached Dragonstone, the ancient fortress rose from the tumultuous sea like a dark, welcoming refuge, as if prepared by fate itself. A profound sense of relief washed over the weary travelers. The dormant volcanoes that sculpted and heated the island showed subtle signs of renewed activity, their inner fire stirring, as if awakening in primal response to the potent presence of the dragons and their riders. The castle's cavernous dragon pit, empty for decades, seemed to stretch and expand, its ancient stones humming with anticipation, eager to accommodate their magnificent aerial mounts. Most remarkably, and with an eerie beauty, the dragon-glass windows embedded throughout the fortress began to glow with their own soft, inner light, providing illumination without any visible source of flame, a beacon of magic restored. The establishment of their new home demanded every ounce of skill, determination, and ingenuity that had forged their family's greatness. They set about rebuilding the long-abandoned sections of the castle, transforming crumbling walls into fortified bastions. Deep within the volcanic caves beneath the island, they established new, sprawling dragon roosts, harnessing the natural geothermal warmth. Slowly, painstakingly, they began the complex, arduous process of creating a self-sufficient society, far removed from the decadent empire that had nurtured them for millennia, yet embracing the same foundational Valyrian principles of magic and mastery. The dragons adapted to their new volcanic environment with surprising ease, as if they, too, sensed that this remote, storm-battered island would be their ultimate sanctuary in the dark times ahead. Their calls echoed through the caves, mingling with the rumble of the earth, creating a new, wild symphony. As years passed, and no word, no traveler, no rumor came from Valyria, the Targaryens found themselves living in a strange, bittersweet state of suspension, caught between profound grief for the home they had lost and immense relief for the lives they had saved. They had preserved their bloodline and their dragons from destruction, but at the cost of becoming permanent exiles from the greatest civilization human history had ever known. Stannis, now blossoming into womanhood, continued to experience prophetic dreams. But these visions, sharper and more vivid than ever, no longer showed the inevitable collapse of the past they had abandoned. Instead, they illuminated glimpses of the future, a new destiny, a new world, a new kingdom they would help to build across the tempestuous narrow sea. Communication networks, once the very arteries of the vast Valyrian freehold, did not merely go silent, they shrieked into oblivion. Sending stones, crafted with ancient magic to transmit thoughts and commands across continents, overloaded with an unbearable psychic and arcane feedback. They detonated in showers of crystalline shards and raw, uncontrolled energy, silencing the voices of thousands simultaneously, replacing them with an abrupt, deafening void. The legendary Great Roads, marvels of fused stone that had carried armies and trade for millennia, groaned under an unseen force. Cracks spread across their perfectly smooth surfaces like jagged lightning bolts, branching and deepening with impossible speed. These indestructible thoroughfares, which had laughed at the ravages of time, began to revert to their base components in cascading waves of destruction, a horrifying unmaking that followed the surge of magical energy back to its very sources, leaving behind only dust and fractured bedrock where once lay impenetrable highways. The 14 flames themselves, the volcanic heart of Valyria, became visible from distances previously deemed impossible. Pillars of fire and corrupted earth, they erupted with a fury that made every recorded volcanic event in human history pale into insignificance. Yet, these were no ordinary eruptions of molten rock and ash. The accumulated magical energies, which had been building within the planet's core for centuries, transformed the fundamental nature of the volcanic material. They birthed substances that burned with an eternal, consuming hunger, yet required no fuel, and unleashed flows of liquid fire that defied gravity, crawling upward like living serpents to scale the sides of ancient pyramids and colossal towers, leaving trails of iridescent, destructive light. Lord Arian's final moments were a testament to this grotesque alchemy. He had spent so many peaceful mornings on the apex of his pyramid, watching the sunrise paint his domain in hues of gold and rose. Now, that very apex, the symbol of his power and peace, simply ceased to exist in any recognizable form. The fused stone, hardened by ages of Valyrian craft, did not melt, nor did it crumble. Instead, it underwent a terrifying, instantaneous transformation, becoming neither solid nor liquid, but something utterly new, a state of matter that human language, even High Valyrian, possessed no words to describe. His last coherent thought, choked by the unreality unfolding around him, was a desperate prayer to the gods of fire and blood, a fervent plea that his family's ancient legacy might somehow survive the total annihilation of everything he had ever known. The great harbor, a bustling nexus that had welcomed ships from every corner of the known world, became a churning cauldron of superheated, glowing water as the magical catastrophe extended its reach beyond the land and into the very sea itself. Merchant vessels, their crews oblivious moments before, preparing for routine voyages to distant shores, spontaneously burst into flames that water, the very essence of the sea, could not extinguish. Their hulls became pyres, their masts skeletal fingers pointing skyward in agony. The meticulously constructed breakwaters and towering docks, the fruit of centuries of patient labor and advanced engineering, vanished, swallowed by waves that glowed with an eerie inner light, moving in patterns that mocked every known law of nature, twisting and convulsing with unnatural energy. Master Coron's death came more slowly, a cruel irony for a man of vast intellect. He perished amidst the cataclysm, frantically attempting to employ his unparalleled knowledge of magical theory to comprehend the incomprehensible maelstrom raging around him. His final note, hastily scratched onto a piece of stone with a fragment of melted metal, detailed phenomena that would have been summarily dismissed as impossible just hours earlier. He wrote of fundamental forces, the very bedrock of interaction between magic and matter, reversing themselves, unraveling the fabric of reality itself. These were conditions, he scrawled in his dying moments, that no living creature could possibly survive, and which, terrifyingly, would persist long after the initial catastrophe had concluded, a permanent scar on the world's natural order. The process of destruction, already beyond mortal comprehension, accelerated through the afternoon. Feedback loops of uncontrolled magic amplified the initial disturbance into something that approached the raw, untamed creative and destructive power that had shaped the world in its earliest, primordial days. The very landscape began to groan and reshape itself, as the accumulated magical energies sought new, twisted equilibrium states that bore no resemblance to anything that had ever existed. Mountains, once majestic and unyielding, collapsed inward with deafening roars, transforming into valleys that immediately filled with grotesque substances, matter that was neither earth nor water nor fire, but partook of all three elements simultaneously. churning with an alien, self-contained life. The population of the Valyrian Peninsula, estimated at over 2 million souls, including nearly 50,000 dragonlords and their families, had no opportunity to escape. No time to even begin to comprehend the nightmare that was devouring them. The transformation occurred with such breathtaking speed that human minds were incapable of processing it, bodies too slow to react, and even the swiftest dragons, accustomed to soaring above any danger, found themselves outpaced by the sheer velocity of the unraveling. One moment, they were living out their daily lives within the greatest civilization humanity had ever achieved, a beacon of magic and power, and the next, they were inextricably fused into a landscape that no longer existed in any form that living beings could inhabit, their forms dissolving, twisting, and reforming into the very fabric of the new, scarred earth. The magical energies released by the doom propagated outward from Valyria at speeds that seemed not to diminish, but to increase with distance, carrying destruction far beyond the peninsula itself. Along the distant coasts of Essos, ancient cities reported colossal tidal waves that did not merely destroy but burned, their towering crests alight with a malevolent, green-tinged flame that left behind scorched earth and boiling seas. Hundreds of miles inland, settlements experienced unprecedented earthquakes that seemed to strike with eerie precision, selectively targeting buildings constructed using Valyrian techniques, as if the very stones resonated with the catastrophic magic of their origin. Even the air itself carried insidious traces of the magical catastrophe, creating bizarre, localized phenomena that persisted for years and seeped into every corner of the known world, whispering of the cataclysm. The final, terrifying stage of the doom arrived when the 14 flames, their volcanic cores so utterly overloaded with raw magical energy that they could no longer maintain physical coherence, did not erupt with fire and ash, but instead imploded. The result was not an explosion, which would have ripped upward and outward, but a horrific, inward collapse. Massive sections of the Valyrian Peninsula simply fell away, consumed by yawning voids that opened beneath them without warning, swallowing cities and mountains whole. Where the great peaks had stood for millions of years, towering sentinels of stone, there remained only empty, fathomless space that quickly filled with the churning, angry waters of the narrow sea, creating the nightmarish body of toxic, perpetually steaming water that would forever after be known as the Smoking Sea. As darkness fell on what had been the glorious Valyrian Peninsula, an unnatural silence, thick and suffocating, settled over waters that bubbled with residual magical energy and glowed with an eerie phosphorescence that had nothing to do with natural marine life. The greatest empire in human history, the pinnacle of arcane power and civilization, had been reduced to a whispered memory in the span of a single, horrific day. Its glittering cities, once teeming with life and magic, were now submerged beneath waves that would remain poisonous for centuries to come, a perpetual testament to hubris. The few ships that had been far enough from the peninsula to survive the initial catastrophe reported that the very stars seemed dimmer that night, their light muted, as if the destruction of Valyria had somehow wounded the heavens themselves, casting a cosmic pall over the world. The doom of Valyria was complete, an event of unparalleled devastation, but its terrifying consequences would echo through history for generations to come, a wound that would never fully heal. The magical catastrophe had not merely destroyed a civilization, it had fundamentally altered the very nature of the world itself, twisting the warp and weft of reality. It created new, unpredictable conditions that would profoundly affect the future development of magic, the behavior and very existence of dragons, and the rise and fall of future empires in ways that no one could yet begin to comprehend. An enduring legacy of ruin. The age of Valyrian dominance was irrevocably over, leaving behind only unspeakable ruins beneath the churning waves and the scattered, desperate remnants of dragon lord families who would carry forward whatever fragile fragments of the old knowledge they could preserve, clinging to a vanished glory. The first reports of the catastrophe did not reach the free cities through official channels or magical communication, which had by then ceased to exist. Instead, They arrived through the terrified, incoherent accounts of sailors whose ships had been providentially far enough from Valyria to survive the initial destruction. These traumatized witnesses spoke of events so utterly impossible that many listeners, desperate for sanity, dismissed their stories as the raving delusions of men driven mad by trauma, tales too horrific to be true. They described a colossal pillar of fire that reached from the scorched earth to the very sky, waters that burned without consuming themselves, and a silence so profound and absolute that it seemed to swallow sound itself before it could travel more than a few yards. A terrifying emptiness in the wake of ultimate destruction. Captain Maester Kevin of the merchant vessel Sunset's Glory had been sailing westward from Volantis, a routine journey, when the horizon behind his ship suddenly blazed with an unnatural, searing light that turned night into day for several minutes, searing itself into the minds of his crew before fading to a sickly, green-tinged glow that persisted for hours, casting an ominous pall. When he, a man of duty, attempted to turn back toward the Valyrian peninsula to investigate the source of this impossible light, his crew, their faces pale with terror, refused to obey. They claimed that the very air tasted of death and ash, and that the compass needles, usually unwavering, spun wildly and erratically whenever they pointed toward their doomed homeland, as if even the Earth's magnetic field had been twisted. His ship was among the very first to bring news of the doom to the outside world, though his account, like others, would not be believed until similar, equally harrowing reports arrived from dozens of other vessels, forming an undeniable chorus of catastrophe. The immediate aftermath in the territories that had formed the outer reaches of the Valyrian Empire was chaos on a scale that defied comprehension. Provincial governors, who had ruled for decades in the unquestioned name of the freehold, suddenly found themselves utterly without instructions, without support from the vanished capital, and without any clear understanding of what had happened to the center of their world, their source of authority and power. Some, clinging to what little order remained, attempted to maintain control by continuing to implement existing policies, a futile gesture against overwhelming ruin. Others, sensing opportunity in the power vacuum, swiftly declared independence, while still others, overcome by fear and despair, simply abandoned their posts entirely to flee toward what they hoped might be safer regions, leaving their provinces to anarchy. In Volantis, the largest and wealthiest of the free cities, the initial reaction to the news of Valyria's destruction evolved through several distinct, agonizing phases. Initial disbelief, fueled by centuries of Valyrian invincibility, gave way to widespread panic as more and more refugee ships, crammed with traumatized survivors, arrived carrying similar accounts of unimaginable catastrophe, each tale reinforcing the horror. The triarchs who governed the city found themselves facing simultaneous challenges from within and without, as various ambitious factions attempted to seize power in the ensuing chaos, while external enemies, sensing opportunity in the Empire's sudden, inexplicable weakness, began to mobilize. The delicate balance of power that had maintained relative peace across much of the known world for centuries collapsed within days, plunging the entire region into brutal, internecine conflicts that would continue for generations, etching a century of blood into history. The economic consequences of the doom rippled outward like destructive waves from a stone dropped in still water, touching every corner of the known world within mere months of the catastrophe. Trade routes that had functioned reliably for centuries, the lifeblood of global commerce, suddenly became impassable as the ships and vital infrastructure that maintained them simply disappeared or were rendered unusable. The standardized currency, backed by the unimpeachable strength of Valyrian gold, instantly lost all value overnight, creating unprecedented financial chaos in markets from the Summer Isles to the vast plains of Essos. Entire industries that had developed solely to serve the Empire's insatiable needs found themselves abruptly without customers, their purpose vanished, while others faced dire shortages of raw materials that could no longer be obtained from the devastated, toxic homeland. The collapse of magical infrastructure had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate destruction. Communication networks that had allowed seamless coordination across vast distances fell utterly silent, leaving scattered garrisons and administrative outposts isolated, without hope of contact with any higher authority, left to fend for themselves in a fractured world. The great roads of fused stone, stripped of the magical forces that had bonded their materials together, began to crack and crumble, making travel increasingly difficult and perilously dangerous, further isolating communities. Aqueducts, towering marvels that had supplied life-giving water to millions of people, failed as their enchantments wore off, forcing mass migrations toward natural water sources that could support only fractions of their original populations, leading to widespread famine and conflict. Perhaps most tragically, the systematic knowledge that had taken millennia to accumulate, the very intellectual bedrock of Valyrian civilization, was lost almost as completely as if it had never existed. The closely guarded techniques for forging Valyrian steel, a peerless metal of legend, died with the masters who had protected their secrets so fiercely, leaving behind only the mystery of its creation. The intricate breeding programs that had produced dragons optimized for specific purposes, from war beasts to ceremonial mounts, were scattered or utterly destroyed, leaving only random survivors whose genetic heritage could not be properly traced or maintained, their lineage broken. The magical practices that had powered Valyrian civilization, from architecture to agriculture, became impossible to replicate as the unique environmental conditions that had made them possible no longer existed, their source poisoned. The few dragons that survived the initial catastrophe found themselves in a world that could no longer adequately support creatures of their nature and immense magical needs. Those magnificent beasts that had been away from the peninsula when the doom occurred gradually weakened and died, their intrinsic connection to the magical forces that sustained them irrevocably severed, their life force slowly ebbing. Wild dragons that had lived in distant lands, far from Valyria, began exhibiting strange, distressed behaviors, as if they sensed that something fundamental had changed in the world's magical balance, a profound cosmic shift. Within a single generation, dragons had become so rare that their very existence was questioned by many who had not seen them personally, relegated to myth. The Targaryen family on Dragonstone represented the largest, though still dwindling, concentration of surviving dragons anywhere in the world. But even they faced unprecedented challenges in maintaining their aerial mounts. The dragons that had made the perilous journey to their island refuge survived the doom itself, but they showed undeniable signs of a gradual decline that no amount of care, no ritual, no magical intervention could reverse. Breeding became increasingly difficult and often unsuccessful, with many eggs failing to hatch, and those that did produce often yielding creatures that were smaller, weaker, and less majestic than their parents, a pale shadow of their former glory. Religious and cultural upheaval inexorably followed the political and economic chaos, as peoples across the former empire struggled to understand what had happened to the mighty civilization that had dominated their world for so long. The fire worship that had spread like wildfire with Valyrian expansion lost much of its fervent appeal, as the seemingly indifferent gods of flame and blood had apparently failed to protect their most devoted followers in their hour of greatest need. Local religions that had been suppressed or marginalized for centuries experienced powerful revivals, as people desperately sought new sources of spiritual comfort and plausible explanations for the unimaginable catastrophe they had witnessed. The mysterious faceless men, whose ambiguous role in the events leading to the doom remained shrouded in secrecy, seemed to vanish as completely as the civilization they had worked so tirelessly to undermine. Some theories suggested that they had achieved their ultimate, destructive purpose and simply disbanded, their work complete. Others proposed that they had been utterly destroyed along with their targets in the very catastrophe they had helped to orchestrate. A few whispered that they had merely moved on to new, even grander objectives, perhaps planning the downfall of other empires in distant, unsuspecting lands where their methods had not yet been recognized, their shadow extending. Environmental damage from the doom extended far beyond the immediate area of destruction, creating problems that would persist for centuries. The smoking sea that now covered the former Valyrian peninsula continued to emit toxic, superheated vapors that affected weather patterns across all of Essos, unleashing unnatural storms and blighted lands. Ash from the magical conflagration was carried by winds to distant regions, poisoning crops and essential water supplies hundreds of miles from its source, creating widespread famine and disease. Marine life throughout the narrow sea and beyond showed unsettling signs of corruption and mutation, making fishing a dangerous endeavor and significantly reducing available food sources for coastal populations, further compounding the misery. The immense power vacuum created by Valyria's sudden disappearance led to a period of unprecedented warfare and political instability across the known world, grimly remembered as the Century of Blood. Former client states and subject peoples who had been held in check for ages by the terrifying threat of dragon retaliation suddenly found themselves free to pursue old grievances, settle ancient scores, and pursue aggressive territorial ambitions. The careful balance of power that had maintained relative peace across much of the known world for centuries collapsed into utter chaos, as dozens of would-be successors to Valyrian hegemony fought fiercely for dominance, carving out new, smaller realms in the ashes of the old. In the eastern provinces of the former empire, the proud descendants of Old Guys began reasserting their ancient claims to the fertile lands around Slaver's Bay. The techniques and traditions that the Valyrians had tried so ruthlessly to destroy proved more resilient than their conquerors had ever imagined, and within decades, new Giscari cities, built upon a foundation of ancient strength, were rising from the ruins of the old, a testament to enduring cultures. The unsullied, those perfect, disciplined soldiers who had served Valyrian masters for generations found new, eager employers among the emerging powers who immediately recognized their unparalleled value in the chaotic new world. Their loyalty now sold to the highest bidder. Cultural preservation became a desperate, urgent priority for the scattered communities of Valyrian descent who had survived the catastrophe. Families who had fled the homeland before the doom, or who had been traveling abroad when it occurred, worked frantically to maintain whatever precious traditions and esoteric knowledge they could remember, struggling against the tide of oblivion. The High Valyrian language, once the lingua franca of half the world, began to fragment into regional dialects as different communities lost contact with each other and developed their own variations, its elegant purity slowly eroding. The Targaryens on Dragonstone found themselves in the unique, solitary position of being the sole remaining dragonlord family with any significant power, a heavy burden to bear. But their isolation from the mainland made it exceedingly difficult for them to influence events across the narrow sea, forcing them to watch from afar. They became custodians of Valyrian tradition by default, solemnly preserving customs, rituals, and knowledge that might otherwise have been lost entirely, a living museum of a dead world. Their dragons, while tragically diminished in number and strength, remained the only living, breathing links to the Empire's glorious, vanished past, sacred beasts. Archaeological expeditions to the Smoking Sea began almost immediately after the doom, driven by the fervent hopes of recovering untold treasure or priceless knowledge from the submerged ruins of Valyria. Most of these ventures, however, ended in horrifying disaster as the intensely toxic environment, permeated by residual magic, proved lethally inimical to human life. While the pervasive magical contamination made traditional salvage techniques impossible, the few artifacts that were successfully recovered often proved to be cursed or inherently dangerous, transforming into volatile, harmful substances that poisoned or severely harmed those who dared to handle them, as if Valyria itself sought to claim all who disturbed its grave. The long-term consequences of the doom extended into realms that could not be immediately measured or fully understood, stretching across millennia. The magical catastrophe had irrevocably altered fundamental forces that govern the interaction between natural and supernatural phenomena, creating new, unpredictable conditions that would affect the development of magic, the behavior of fantastical creatures, and the rise and fall of future civilizations in ways that would only become apparent over centuries or even millennia, a cosmic reordering. Trade networks that had connected distant continents began to break down and wither as the central coordination and vast commercial power provided by Valyrian commerce disappeared. Without the empire's vast merchant fleets and standardized systems of exchange, communication between far-flung regions became sporadic, unreliable, and dangerous. Knowledge and vital innovations that had spread rapidly during the height of Valyrian power now moved slowly or not at all, leading to technological and cultural stagnation in many parts of the world, plunging them into a new dark age. The survivors of the catastrophe, whether they were refugees who had narrowly escaped the peninsula or descendants of Valyrian colonists in distant lands, carried with them a profound, enduring sense of loss and displacement that would shape their worldview for generations. They had witnessed, firsthand, the instantaneous destruction of what they believed to be the absolute pinnacle of human achievement, the shining star of civilization. And many never fully recovered from the overwhelming psychological trauma of seeing their entire civilization, their entire world, reduced to ash and memory in a single, horrific day, leaving them forever scarred. As the immediate chaos of the post-Doom period gradually settled into new patterns of conflict and tentative cooperation, it became undeniably clear that the world had been fundamentally, irrevocably changed by the loss of Valyrian dominance. The age of vast, unified empires had abruptly ended, replaced by a more fragmented, perilous political landscape where smaller powers fiercely competed for regional influence rather than global hegemony. The great questions of governance, culture, and human achievement would have to be answered anew by peoples who could no longer look to Valyria as either a shining model or an unquestioned master, its shadow banished. Today, for long centuries after the Great Catastrophe, the smoking sea stretches where once the mightiest empire in human history cast its vast shadow across half the known world. The waters that now cover the Valyrian peninsula shimmer with an otherworldly, poisonous luminescence, their surface occasionally broken by the skeletal remains of dragon bones that rise like ancient, silent monuments from the depths, spectral reminders of a lost age. These pale remnants, weathered by centuries of toxic brine and residual magic, serve as the only tombstones for a civilization that once commanded the very elements themselves, its name now a chilling legend. Sailors who brave the dangerous waters speak in hushed, fearful tones of the sights that await those foolish or desperate enough to venture into the heart of the smoking sea. On rare, clear days, when the perpetual, choking mist lifts just enough to reveal the seafloor far below, they claim to see the tops of colossal pyramids still reaching upward through the poisoned depths, their fused stone surfaces now home to grotesque, mutated creatures that evolution never intended, products of arcane corruption. The great roads that once carried the wealth of continents can sometimes be glimpsed beneath the glowing waves, their perfectly fitted stones still holding together after all these years. A chilling testament to the engineering mastery of a people who learned to bend the very earth to their will, only to be consumed by it. The dragon bones that occasionally wash ashore on distant coastlines have become objects of wonder and reverence, imbued with a strange power across the known world. Each massive vertebra tells a silent story of creatures that soared through ancient skies when the world was young and magic flowed as freely as water, an epic of giants. Children in pentos gather fragments of dragon scale that gleam like black jewels in the sunlight, clutching them as talismans. Meanwhile, scholars in Old Town study dragon teeth the size of swords, seeking to understand the impossible biology of beasts that defied every natural law yet known to man, forever chasing lost knowledge. In the great libraries that miraculously survived the Empire's fall, scribes continue to copy and painstakingly preserve what precious few Valyrian texts remain. Though each generation finds the ancient High Valyrian increasingly difficult to read as the living language slowly fades from memory, its nuances lost to time. The epic poems and detailed histories that survive speak of a time when men walked among wonders as casually as we might stroll through a garden, when the manipulation of fire and stone was as common as weaving cloth or forging iron, a truly golden age. These fragments of a lost golden age inspire both profound wonder and deep melancholy in those who study them, offering tantalizing glimpses of achievements that may never be equaled again, a sorrowful reminder of what once was. The Targaryens, last scions of the dragonlord families, have carried their heritage across the narrow sea to establish a new dynasty in Westeros. Their dragons, though much diminished from the great beasts that once darkened Valyrian skies, still represent the most tangible, potent link to that vanished world, living symbols of a lost power. Each time one of these magnificent creatures takes wing above the Red Keep in King's Landing, observers are reminded that the blood of old Valyria still flows in human veins, carrying with it the memory of an age when humanity reached heights that touched the very realm of gods. The lessons of Valyria echo through the silent corridors of power wherever ambitious rulers dream of building empires that will last forever, a cautionary whisper. Wise counselors murmur reminders that even the mightiest civilization can be brought low by the very forces that elevated it to greatness, a truth etched in fire and ash. The Valyrians mastered fire and blood, dragons and stone, forging an empire unparalleled. Yet their mastery became their doom when they pushed beyond the sacred boundaries that nature and the gods had established, delving into forbidden power. Their story serves as both an inspiration to boundless ambition and a terrifying warning, showing what dizzying heights human will can achieve while demonstrating the terrible, ultimate price of flying too close to the sun. In the temples of the Lord of Light, where sacred flames dance in brass braziers and cast shifting, hypnotic shadows on ancient walls, priests still speak the old prayers in High Valyrian, though few truly understand the archaic words they recite. The religion that spread across the world in the wake of Valyrian expansion has outlived the empire that carried it, adapting and evolving to serve new peoples in new lands, a testament to faith's resilience. The sacred fires continue to burn, carrying forward the flame worship that once united millions under the banner of the Freehold, transformed now into something both intimately familiar and unsettlingly strange. The free cities that once served as Valyria's western outposts have grown into independent, formidable powers in their own right, each developing its unique character while retaining subtle, haunting traces of their imperial heritage, a living legacy. In Tyrosh, the vibrant purple dyes that once adorned dragonlord robes now color the opulent garments of merchant princes who rule through the power of gold rather than dragon fire. Lys maintains its reputation for beauty and pleasure, though the elaborate festivities of the modern city pale beside the legendary, extravagant celebrations of old Valyria, a faded echo. Myr continues to produce fine steel and intricate mechanisms, though the deepest secrets of true Valyrian steel died with the smiths who forged it in the scorching fires of the 14 Flames, a knowledge forever lost. Scholars and dreamers still venture to the perilous edges of the smoking sea, driven by fervent hopes of recovering some fragment of lost knowledge or untold treasure from the ruins beneath the waves. Most return with nothing but terrifying tales of toxic mists that burn the lungs and waters that blister the skin, haunted by their ordeal. But a select few claim to have glimpsed wonders that defy description, ancient automatons of metal and magic still moving through drowned halls, performing their forgotten tasks, books written on materials that resist both water and time, their pages aglow with ancient lore, chambers filled with dragon eggs that glow with their own eerie inner light, waiting for conditions that may never come again, forever dormant. The memory of Valyria lives on, not just in ruins and legends, but in the vibrant songs of bards and the captivating stories told by mothers to children throughout the known world. These tales, embellished through countless retellings, paint pictures of a realm where magic was as common as morning dew and dragons soared through skies painted with a perpetual, glorious sunset, a paradise lost forever. While the intricate tapestries of Valyrian history may have frayed into myth and whispers, their essential truth shines undimmed, a testament to humanity's audacious reach. Once, in a crucible where the raw power of primordial fire met the boundless ambition of dreams, mankind forged a civilization of unparalleled splendor, a peak of achievement that truly defied the heavens. Yet, the great wheel of existence turns relentlessly. In the fractured world Valyria left shattered, new contenders rise to grasp at the scattered remnants of power. The Iron Throne of Westeros, built on conquest and fragile allegiances. The merchant princes of the free cities, whose empires are woven from gold and intrigue. The Dothraki calls, their dominion carved by steel and horseflesh across vast, endless plains. All these forces now play their roles in the relentless, cyclical dance of ambition and triumph, of creation and inevitable decline. Each, in their hubris, believes their reign will outlast the sands of time, blind to the echoes of forgotten empires. But none, not a single one, has yet even approached the sheer majesty and terrifying scale of what was lost when the 14 flames, Valyria's very heart, erupted with inward fury and consumed their own creators. Perhaps it must be so. For the world, still scarred by that cataclysm, may not yet be prepared for another civilization wielding such absolute dominion over the primal forces of nature, for such power invariably breeds a doom of its own. The ashes of Valyria, scattered across the smoking sea, stand as an eternal monument, a chilling testimony to the fleeting nature of all earthly glory. It whispers the ancient truth that every empire, no matter how grand, carries within its very foundations the seeds of its own destruction, and that even the mightiest dragons, those magnificent winged beasts, must eventually yield their fire and return to the earth from which they soared. As you drift toward the precipice of sleep this night, allow your mind to wander, to trace the gentle, phosphorescent waves of the smoking sea. Envision the ancient bones of forgotten kings and dragons resting in tranquil repose beneath waters that still glow with the last, lingering traces of a magic that once illuminated an entire world. Feel the soft, gray ash, delicate as fallen snow, sifting through the landscapes of your dreams, carrying with it the phantom memories of a civilization that burned with such blinding brilliance, its light could be seen from the very stars themselves. The dragons may have vanished into legend, their pyramids lie drowned beneath toxic, churning seas, and the grand Valyrian roads crumble slowly back into the stone from which they were so meticulously hewn. Yet, the dream of Valyria endures, eternal and unchanging. It lives within that indomitable part of the human spirit that forever reaches toward the sky, yearning to touch the realm of gods and dragons that waits, ever tantalizing, beyond the fragile boundaries of our mortal world. Sleep well, and may your dreams be filled with the wonder of distant, beating wings and the gentle, golden warmth of dragonfire painting shimmering patterns across endless, twilight skies. And so, the story of Valyria reminds us that even the greatest empires are not eternal. From unimaginable power to complete destruction, their fate echoes a timeless truth that ambition, magic, and dominance always come with a price. Personally, I find this story both beautiful and haunting, a reminder of how fragile even the strongest civilizations can be. But what do you think? Do you believe Valyria's fall was fate or consequence? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd really love to hear your perspective. And if you enjoyed this journey, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us again here on Scottish Sleep Stories for more relaxing tales from history and legend. Until next time, sleep well.